Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating chapters of history, the Iberian Conquest of the Americas. Picture this, it's the early 1500s, and European explorers are setting sail, not knowing what to expect on the other side of the ocean. What they found was mind-blowing. Not only did they stumble upon a vast landmass, but they also encountered vibrant cultures unlike anything they'd ever seen. Let's break it down. First up, we've got Christopher Columbus making waves in the Caribbean between 1492 and 1502. Then, there's Hernán Cortés, who rocked Aztec Mexico from 1519 to 1521. Meanwhile, Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro were busy in Inca Peru from 1528 to 1532. And let's not forget Juan de Grijalva and Hernán Cortés, again, making moves in Mayan Yucatan and Guatemala in the early 1500s. Now, let's zoom in on some of these indigenous civilizations. The Aztecs were holding it down in Central America, with their capital, Tenochtitlan, sitting pretty on an island in Lake Texcoco. Over in South America, the Incas were dominating the Andes and coastal regions, with their capital at Cusco, Peru. And although the Maya civilization was past its prime by the time the Spanish arrived, they still had a strong presence in the Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemala. But wait, there's more! The Tainos and Caribs were scattered across the Caribbean, each with their own regional leaders. And then there's the Tupi-Guarani, hanging out in the Amazon rainforest and along Brazil's coast, with thousands of tribes making up their population. Now, let's talk about agriculture in the pre-Columbian Americas. When the Europeans arrived, they were in for a surprise. These indigenous societies were growing crops that the Europeans had never seen before. It was like stepping into a whole new world of agriculture. The Amerindian farmers were cultivating crops like cassava, maize, potatoes, beans, squash, tomatoes, and chili peppers. On the other hand, the Iberians back in Europe were more familiar with crops like wheat, barley, cabbage, onions, garlic, and carrots. But here's the kicker. The agriculture in the Americas was just as sophisticated and productive as what the Europeans were doing. Each indigenous group had their own unique farming methods. For example, the Tupi-Guarani were using a simple slash-and-burn technique called swidden agriculture. They relied on rain to water their crops. Meanwhile, the Inca people were mastering the art of terracing in the mountains and building irrigation networks in the valleys and plains. Over in the Caribbean, the Taino were raising their crops on large mounds known as canuco. And let's not forget the Aztecs, who were building impressive irrigated terraces on mountain slopes and even floating gardens on freshwater lakes around their capital city. The Maya had their own system called milpa, where they rotated crops between fields to keep the soil fertile. They were really in tune with their land. Now, let's fast forward to the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Columbus was the first European to reach the shores in 1492, but he thought he had landed in Asia. He didn't really conquer any indigenous people himself, but he set up shop in the Dominican Republic, where he made the locals work for him, searching for gold and producing food for the colonists. But it was Hernán Cortés who made the big moves. He invaded the Aztec Empire with the help of indigenous allies, capitalizing on internal divisions within the empire. By 1521, he had captured the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. Meanwhile, Francisco Pizarro was doing his thing in Peru, capturing the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in 1532 and eventually bringing down the entire Inca Empire by 1572 with the help of indigenous groups who had grievances against the Incas. Alright, let's delve into how Spanish America was organized after the conquests. So, once Hernán Cortés wrapped up his business in the Aztec Empire, the Crown of Castile got down to business. They established the Kingdom of New Spain, covering a massive area including present-day Mexico, parts of the American Southwest, Central America, Northern South America, and even the Philippines. Now, they didn't call it a colony. It was a kingdom, with the king holding all the cards. In 1535, they created the Viceroyalty of New Spain, with Antonio de Mendoza y Pacheco as the first viceroy. Mexico City became the capital, rising from the ashes of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. The Spanish went to town, building palaces and churches in their own style, while wiping out the old Aztec buildings. Over in Peru, things were shaping up differently. The Spanish handed out titles to conquistadors, giving them the right to rule the land they conquered. South America was sliced into chunks, with regions like New Castile, New Toledo, New Andalusia, and Tierra Firme popping up. In 1542, they revamped everything into the Viceroyalty of Peru, with Lima as the capital. But it wasn't until the fifth Viceroy, Francisco Álvarez de Toledo, that things really started to come together. Now, let's talk about the Spanish colonial economy. They set up a two-tiered system, Spaniards on top, Amerindians on the bottom. Spaniards ran the show, managing land, mining, and administration, while Amerindians provided the labor. In return, they got protection and lessons in Christianity. The Spanish made sure this hierarchy stuck with three institutions: the requerimiento, encomienda, and repartimiento. Soldiers would read the requerimiento, basically saying, submit or face the consequences. Then came the encomienda, where noble Spaniards got control of native land and labor. It was a thinly veiled form of slavery, where Amerindians had to meet quotas or suffer the consequences. In 1542, the new laws tried to rein in the abuse, limiting encomenderos to 2 generations of control. But the resistance was fierce, and eventually, the repartimiento system took over, with government officials regulating indigenous labor. In the 17th century, the hacienda system emerged, with private landowners recruiting free labor instead of relying on forced labor. These haciendas became a fixture, surviving well into the 20th century. Now, let's talk about the Portuguese colonization of Brazil. Unlike the Spanish conquests, the Portuguese approach to Brazil was a bit different. They weren't initially looking to conquer. Instead, they saw Brazil as a prime spot for trade, especially since they were already busy in the Indian Ocean. So, instead of launching huge military campaigns, they focused on trading with the native Brazilians and duking it out with rivals like the French. The native Tupi people weren't seen as a civilization to be conquered, but more as a source of labor. To get the colonization ball rolling, the Portuguese crown tried something called hereditary captaincies, giving private individuals control over large chunks of land and the people living on it. Sound familiar? It's kinda like the Spanish encomiendas. But out of the original 15 captaincies, only 2 really thrived, Pernambuco and São Vicente. Pernambuco, owned by Duarte Coelho, became a hub for sugar production, satisfying Europe's sweet tooth. Meanwhile, São Vicente, under Martim Afonso de Souza, got into the sugar game too, but its main gig was selling slaves. With most of the captaincies flopping and the French causing trouble, King John III of Portugal decided in 1549 to take matters into his own hands. He sent Tomé de Souza to establish a central government in Brazil, starting with the founding of Salvador da Bahia. Souza also worked on fixing up the old captaincies and spreading Catholicism with the help of Jesuit missionaries. But like their Spanish counterparts, the Portuguese settlers were after land and an easier life. They wanted the indigenous Tupi to do the heavy lifting. Jesuits tried converting them to Christianity and recruiting them for farm work, while adventurers called banderos enslaved many Tupi as they searched for riches in the interior. The Tupi weren't exactly keen on the whole farming thing, and were prone to running away or getting sick from European diseases. So, the Portuguese turned to African slavery, a system they were already using in their Atlantic sugar plantations. The impact of all this colonization on the Americas was immense. Europeans tried replacing indigenous farming methods with their own, often with limited success. The encomienda and hacienda systems wreaked havoc on indigenous life, with many dying from overwork or disease. Speaking of disease, that's another brutal aspect. Diseases like measles and smallpox wiped out millions of indigenous people who had no immunity. Before European contact, there were around 60 million indigenous folks in the Americas. By the 1600s, a staggering 90% of them were gone.